It's funny how a simple cup of coffee can really kind of spiral, into this whole thought process. Like
Hmm.
this morning, I'm looking at my choices, right? And I got the ethical, locally roasted beans,
Right.
but then there's the one that's, well, a little more forgiving on the old bank account.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, like, what really drives our choices as consumers? Which actually perfectly sets the stage for our deep dive today. We're cracking open your excerpts from Consumers, Society, and Marketing.
Oh, excellent. And it sounds like your coffee dilemma really speaks to a central tension the book explores, that push and pull between wanting to be ethical in our consumption habits, but also facing this system that often prioritizes, well, convenience and cost.
It's like the authors are peeking right into our shopping carts, analyzing every last thing we toss in there. So, where do we even begin to untangle this whole web of consumers, society, and marketing? They're like intertwined, right?
Yeah, they really are. Mudum and Ghazali, the authors, they kind of take us back,
Yeah.
back to the roots of how consumer society even came to be. And they make the point that, sure, consumption has always been around, but marketing, it's changed the game completely.
Hmm.
They say it basically amplifies our desires, makes us crave stuff way beyond just, basic survival needs.
So instead of just buying what we need, we're now on this hamster wheel of wants and like aspirational purchases and all that.
Yeah, you got it. And to illustrate this whole shift, they bring up a really interesting example. Holidays. Think like Christmas or Eid. Celebrations that used to be about tradition and family, right?
Right.
Now, retailers have a field day. Targeted ads, emotional appeals, this whole you got to buy, or you'll miss out mentality.
Wow. I'd never thought about it like that, how holidays are kind of not exploited, I guess, for sales. It's brilliant, but also kind of, I don't know, a little disturbing. And this relentless marketing, it has real consequences, right? I mean, think about all that pressure to spend, 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 even if you don't have it. Normalizing debt. It's like happiness is measured by how much stuff you have.
Absolutely, yeah. The book argues that these tactics feed this whole culture of consumerism, where we're constantly being told to want more, to need more, and it's often at the expense of, like you said, our well-being and our bank accounts too.
Yeah, it's a lot when you actually stop and think about it. But this brings up a question, right? Like, who's really steering the ship here? Who's ultimately responsible for what we choose to buy? The excerpt about fast food and like its health effects really got me thinking about this whole debate.
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's where the book delves into this classic tug of war, you know, personal responsibility versus the influence of these huge industries.
It's like that whole nature versus nurture argument, but with like cheeseburgers thrown in the mix.
Exactly. So you've got one side, the consumer sovereignty camp.
Hmm.
They're all about free will. Consumers have choices, they argue. No one's forcing anyone to eat fast food, right?
Yeah.
People should educate themselves, know the risks, and then make true decisions.
Okay, that makes sense, I guess, at a very basic level, but it feels a little too simple, don't you think? Especially when you consider how much marketing there is for unhealthy stuff and how it often targets, well, let's be honest, the most vulnerable among us.
Oh, absolutely. You're hitting on a key argument from the other side, which really emphasizes the overwhelming power of, they call it marketing muscle. This constant barrage of ads strategically placed like near schools or using cartoon characters to draw kids in. It can be tough to make rational choices when you're up against that.
Right. It's like, are we really making the choice or is the choice kind of made for us? It's all about who has the power in this whole equation.
Exactly, and that's where the book introduces this idea of consumer vulnerability.
Mm.
Basically, they're saying, look, it's not always as simple as just free will. There are all these external factors at play that can influence us, often without us even realizing it.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. What are some ways that like our vulnerability as consumers is being, I don't know, exploited, I guess?
Well, they talk about both internal and external factors that come into play. Internally, it could be something as simple as like having vague preferences. You walk into a store, you kind of know what you need, but then, bam, overwhelmed by all the choices, right?
Tell me about it. Decision fatigue is real, my friend.
Right. And that's when we become super vulnerable to like those impulse buys or those flashy packages designed to catch your eye.
Totally. Okay, but what about the external pressures, the things we don't really have control over?
That's where the whole power dynamic of the market really comes in. The book talks about deceptive online practices, for example. Think about those websites with those sneaky countdown timers like hurry, buy now, or those dark patterns that trick you into clicking agree to stuff you haven't even read.
Oh man, it's scary how easily we can be manipulated, right? Like, what other external pressures are out there influencing our choices?
Well, They also talk about limited access as a huge factor.
Right.
Let's say you're all about buying ethical, sustainable produce, right? But what if the closest organic market is like a million miles away?
Hmm.
Or what if it's just way too expensive? When we don't have readily available alternatives, it's hard to put our values into action, you know?
Yeah. It's like the system itself is making it harder to be a conscious consumer.
In a way, yeah. And this kind of brings us back to your coffee conundrum earlier. It's not just as easy as picking between two bags of beans, right? You got time constraints, those tempting marketing messages, even just the smell of fresh brewed coffee. It all plays a role in our decision-making, often on a subconscious level.
So, given all of this, all these forces pushing and pulling us in different directions, how can we, like, as consumers, actually navigate this whole thing? Is it even possible to make choices that actually align with our values?
That's where the book takes a really empowering turn, actually. They move from talking about our vulnerabilities to exploring the power of like collective action and resistance.
Okay, so you're talking about consumer activism, right? Like fighting back against these systems.
Exactly. Mudum and Ghazali, they argue that consumers aren't powerless in this. In fact, history is full of examples of people coming together to demand better and hold corporations accountable.
Okay, that's good to hear. Give me some examples, though. What does that actually look like in action?
Well, some of these tactics have been around for ages. Yeah. Like think about the Boston Tea Party. We see it as this historical event, but at its core, it was consumer activism, plain and simple. They boycotted a product to disrupt a system they saw as unfair.
Wow, I never thought about it like that, but it's true.
Right. And that same spirit, it's still alive and well today. You see it in boycotts of companies with bad labor practices, boycotts supporting sustainable businesses, and of course the whole world of online activism, right? Social media gives people this amazing platform to speak out and demand transparency.
Yeah, it's incredible how technology has, like, democratized activism, made it easier than ever to rally people around these issues.
Totally. And the book emphasizes that this ability to connect and organize is a huge asset for consumers who want to make a real difference. Even small actions, when you multiply them by millions of people, it can have a real ripple effect.
It's a good reminder that our choices really do matter, both individually and as a collective. And speaking of collective action, it reminded me of this other fascinating and maybe kind of unexpected example. The book gives the influence of VSKO girls on sustainable practices.
Right.
It's like VSKO girls with their scrunchies and hydro flasks and all that. You wouldn't necessarily think of them as like leading a revolution, right?
Right.
But when you think about it, their whole thing, like the reusable stuff, thrifting, keeping it simple, it kind of reflects this shift, especially among young people, towards sustainability.
Yeah, and the book actually uses them as an example of how even if it starts as a trend like a social media thing, it can still overlap with these bigger social issues and have an impact.
It's like they accidentally became activists, not by, protesting or whatever, but just by making different choices in their everyday lives.
Yeah, exactly. And those choices, they send a message. They tell businesses, hey, this is what consumers care about now.
It's like they voted with their wallets, basically. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into consumers, society, and marketing, what's the big takeaway here? What are we walking away with?
Well, I think Mudum and Ghazali leave us with a pretty empowering message. The first step to having more power as consumers is understanding how vulnerable we actually are.
Okay, that makes sense.
Like, by recognizing all the things that influence our choices, the marketing, the social pressure, the lack of options sometimes, that's how we can become more conscious consumers.
So it's not about like swearing off buying anything ever again, but more about just being aware and making intentional choices.
Exactly. It's about pausing before you buy something and asking yourself, do I actually need this? Or do I just want it because of like an ad I saw? Or who am I supporting with this purchase? Are there better options out there, ethically speaking?
It's like putting on those critical thinking glasses before you whip out your wallet. It's a call to action, really. Like, we're not just passive consumers along for the ride. We have the power to shape the marketplace, make it more ethical, more sustainable. And that's something we can all do, whether it's agonizing over coffee beans or just thinking about the bigger picture of our choices.
Absolutely. Every little bit counts.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. I feel like my brain's doing backflips. And listeners, we want to hear from you. What parts of consumers, society, and marketing really got you thinking? Hit us up on social media, and until next time, happy and conscious consuming, everyone.